we're looking at the client saying, we're not going to do anything different. We're going to do the same things we've always done, but now we need to charge more because we realize we have these additional costs because we haven't built it into our margin or whatever. So that's where the tricky discussions around price increases come up. And it's just a visibility thing. Like, you probably always needed to charge more. You just didn't know it until we started to do this kind of analysis.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel Petitpas. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I am joined again today by Carson Pierce. Carson, thanks for being here.
Hey, good to be back. I almost wore my Parakeeto hat on. One of these days, we're going to show up as twins, but not today.
That would be great. We'll both wear full Parakeeto attire, our Parakeeto t-shirts, our Parakeeto hats, all of the swag. That'd be great. Until then, we're going to talk about something that comes up with a lot of clients, which is account and project management time. Do you charge for it? Do you not charge for it? Should it show up on the client invoice? Why clients struggle with answering this question of how to charge for it, how much to charge for it, should they charge for it? Is it going to piss the client off? And sometimes it does, right? So definitely a very tricky and nuanced subject, and one that I'm excited to talk about. Before we dig in, Carson, why did you feel this was important for us to dig into on the show today?
Yeah. Surprisingly, well, at least surprising to me, it still comes up a lot. I mean, I've been working in the project management side for decades. That makes me sound super old, but there used to be a time when it was a big problem. Like, oh, of course we can charge for design and development, blah, but we're not going to talk about charging for project management because clients just won't have it. That's just part of servicing the account. And those days I felt like we're long gone. And of course, our clients understand that we charge for project management time, et cetera, et cetera. But it's surprising as I dig into agency after agency, quite often we'll see a gap between how much effort is being put in and how much we charge for. And there's lots of reasons that can happen. But one that comes up a surprising amount to me is we're not actually charging enough for our project management efforts. And this is kind of getting into the weeds, but it felt like I've seen it enough times it was worth talking about. So,
all right. Well, with all of that, let's talk about why, right? Why is this a problem? What are some of the reasons that you see this become a sticking point with clients that you work with?
Yeah. So there's a couple of reasons. One is going back to this perception that agency clients will not pay for project management time. And I'm not sure how that perception is sticking around, but it is. I would like to say that that's something from the past. Just go ahead and start, building your pricing around your project management efforts as well. But yeah, some agencies are just stuck in this idea that, oh, we can't charge for that because it's not a tangible deliverable thing. So I guess we should put that to bed. Like, yes, you should be charging for your project management and account management time. It is all part of the work of delivering, what you do for your clients. And the work that your PMs and AMs are doing is valuable. There's that side of things too, which is we should not be treating those roles as overhead. They are doing the work, the client work. So let's capture that. The second reason, and maybe the more problematic one, that people aren't charging for project management time is it's really hard to pin down. It gets a little fuzzy, right? If you're a developer, you sit down and for 6 hours, you're hammering out code. That's very easy to put some numbers around. But for PMs, They're responding to an email for 30 seconds. They're getting into a status call and they talk about 7 different clients over half an hour. And, there's a pile of task switching that happens. How do you even articulate how much effort went into any given client when it's all just sort of split up in little tiny ways? Generally, PMs have a really hard time tracking their time because of those reasons. And so it just becomes this nebulous thing where you're like, I don't know how to even calculate how much effort went into that from a PM or AM perspective.
Yeah. I think you've touched on some really relevant sort of tactical issues, in particular with client perception and also with capturing time, which is definitely very hard for these project and account management roles, especially where they might be spread across a lot of different things. I'll add that I think the problem that is actually underneath both of those things and that leads to this not being charged for, whether implicitly or explicitly, is a fundamental sort of lack of understanding of the business model. And I think in a lot of cases, not having an adequate separation of price and scope, right? And so this is, I think, really problematic when the way that an agency comes up with their price is intrinsically linking time and money, right? So like a time and materials billing model is a good example of this, where it's like, well, we will charge the client for project management hours, therefore they need to be tracked and they show up on the invoice. But as you move towards like a flat rate pricing model, for example, well, you could charge for project and account management time without that ever being visible to the client at all. It's just a question of making sure that however that price is structured, you have enough margin to absorb that cost, which like I would argue is always necessary. But I think for a lot of clients, it's overlooked simply because the way that they think about margin, the way they think about pricing is not conducive to taking all of those factors into account and creating a separation between price and how that price is presented to the client, which could take a million different shapes, and scope, which is pretty much going to take one shape every time and hopefully account for all the costs that they need to account for to be profitable as a business. And that will be my soapbox today.
There's another aspect of this too, which is when you mentioned the model, there are 2 different ways of looking at your business depending on how you are thinking about your project management time. And one of them is where you are definitely counting it towards the effort. You're putting it as part of your calculation for average billable rate. And what that means is your average billable rate will look lower. You've got more effort going in, more hours going in, and your ABR will look lower. And then there's the flip side, which is you don't count it. It's part of your overhead in that case. And you think your ABR is great. Your ABR looks strong. But your margins look better, but in actual fact, it's just because you're not even trying to charge for that time, and it's going to bite you somewhere. So being able to look at your model and understand how it fits into the big scheme of things in terms of your profitability is really critical.
Yeah. We'll dig into that rabbit hole, right? Which is like, there are 2 ways to price this in. You can price it in directly, or you can price it in indirectly into the margin target. And I'm a huge proponent of things that are complex or operationally difficult to lock down, to move those into the margin target. I feel that way about utilization. I feel that way about overhead. And I think indirect delivery expenses, which would be this like impossible to track project management overhead or account management overhead, is also a strong candidate for being moved into that target where that makes sense. So anyway, without getting into the details there, let's talk about really quickly. I want to double click on some of the things that you surfaced. So the client insecurity, the pushback on charging for project management time. Let's talk a little bit more about how that comes up, how that manifests itself, and maybe how to think about that part of the issue. When a client says, hey, I don't want to pay for project management, or maybe the firm just thinks like, I don't know if the client's going to respond well to this.
Yeah. So like I said, historically, that was a bigger issue. And there was a time where as an industry, we kind of started saying, well, hey, project management time is valuable. We want to charge for it, but we're not sure how our clients are going to respond to that. And then it would just kind of get, built into other prices. So, the whole abstracted pricing where you don't actually have to see a line item. But then it became more and more acceptable to just charge for your PM time, put it on the invoice. It's fine. Agent or clients were fully accepting of 20-25% project management time, they got it. And so when I see agencies now that are still struggling with that, I do think it's more on the agency side than the client side. I mean, there might be some situations where clients are hesitant to pay too much for it. But mostly it's the client just not having the confidence to go like, no, this is something that we should be charging for, and building it in there. Now, there's a cap on that. And I think where agencies really start to push back is when you start getting over like 30% and they start saying, hey, we're paying a lot to just manage the work. We're not actually getting a lot of work out of this. And so there has to be some balance there. But for the most part, if you're being reasonable about it, I just don't think clients are balking too much at that right now.
Yeah. And I think this is a particularly relevant conversation in the context of time and materials, or some kind of similar type of situation where the client needs or expects to see some kind of very detailed breakdown that has to do with who is doing the work and for how long. And is probably a lot less relevant. And in fact, I would argue is completely irrelevant in the case of like flat pricing, deliverable-based pricing, productized pricing, value-based pricing, where you're actually just going to be pointing towards deliverables and the price associated to those deliverables. And then in those cases, of course, project management time needs to be considered as a cost in your margin equation on the back end, but may never make its way to being client facing. I would also argue that even in the case of the time materials instance, like let's say for sure the project management time is going to be like a lot, and that the client's going to be upset about it, or they don't really like paying for it. You can still price it in. It just means that you have to sort of inflate your hourly rates everywhere else to make the margins work. And you kind of touched on this earlier, right? Which is like, you might say you're charging $170 an hour, but after all the project management time that's going to go in, that you're actually going to end up with an effective rate of like 140, which might be your actual target. But yeah, there are ways to sort of get around that if you understand how to separate time and money a little bit in your pricing model, which I think is where a lot of people get stuck on this. Yeah.
So you're touching on, there's a simple way to deal with this, and you've already talked a little bit about that. Talk about the hard ways for a second, though, because I think it's important to understand why we land where we land with the simpler version. And that's because when agencies are struggling with figuring out how much project management time do they need, how much should they be charging for it, all that sort of thing, they're trying to calculate that. So they're looking at their team, trying to understand how much effort is going in. And inevitably that becomes a time tracking question. And so then we run into all the barriers around time tracking that we already discussed. So then it's like, well, do we just get our PMs to get really serious about their time tracking and try to log everything to client work in a very accurate way, which almost always fails because it is so difficult to do. It's like, okay, I was in a 30-minute call. I talked about 7 clients. Am I going to sit down after that call for 10 minutes and sort out all my timesheets? You would spend half your day doing timesheets, and it's not effective. We did kind of play around with this idea of just having one big bucket for time tracking, where dump all your time into this one place. Now I understand that I'm spending 25 hours a week on client work, and I know what my clients are, and I can just reallocate that at the end of the week. It's a lot of overhead to do that as well. So that doesn't always work. An even simpler version is just applying a percentage. Like, okay, we're not going to worry about exactly how much time you spend per client. We're just going to say, hey, it's 20% of all the other effort. We're going to add that on for project management. And the problem I kind of run into with that is around not really understanding which clients are taking up your time. Like I always like to know, hey, this client eats up 40% of our money with project management, and this one only has 10%. So you miss out on some of that. So there's problems with all of these different ways of going about it. And then you and I were chatting about it and kind of landed on an even simpler version, which you've hinted at already, but I'm curious to get into it in more detail around just building it into your margins.
Yeah. So yeah, I think this is a really important discussion around these account and project management roles, because to your point, from firm to firm, the nature of the work and the nature of that role looks very different. You know, like you ask 10 account managers to describe their day-to-day, you're going to get 10 different answers. The same is true for the PMs. And to your point, they are notoriously difficult roles to actually capture and track time for, because of how small the time increments are that their day can go by in, as well as the sort of the amount of conversations, meetings, tasks that they do that span several clients all at once, right? So the status meeting where you're talking about 10 different projects, like how do you possibly put that into the timesheets? It's incredibly cumbersome, and you could argue that there's, technology is going to get more and more helpful at that, but like I think we still have a long way to go until your Fathom AI meeting recorder is going to be able to tell you that you talked about this client for 46 seconds and logs it out. It's like, and it's like, does that even matter? Right. Is that even worth getting to? So I think that at a fundamental level, you've touched on the important thing, which is we have to agree, right? We've got to account for the cost of account and project management in our pricing. That's a given, right? If we don't, then whatever that cost is coming out of our bottom line. So we need to know what we're modeling for that cost. And there's two ways to account for it. By the way, this is true for every other expense in the business. There's two ways to account for that cost. You can do it directly, in that when you calculate what the costs on a project are going to be, you calculate how much project management or account management time you are pricing into that engagement. Or you can account for it indirectly, which is to say it doesn't show up in the scope of work that you create to figure out what will it cost us to get this project done, but it is accounted for in the margin target that you set, right? So to give you a practical example of this, I could say, hey, we have this project, and on this project, we're going to have, $10,000 of costs that includes project management time, and we want to aim for a 70% margin on that engagement. And therefore, we need to charge, in this case, $34,000 roughly, or $33,000 and $333, et cetera. So that would get us our 70% margin. And we've set that at that level because we know that we expect our project and account managers to be roughly, 50% billable. And we know that we can reliably get them to track that 50% billable time because they only typically work on a couple of big clients and projects at a time. And it's reasonably feasible for them to be tracking their time against those things. And that's great. Whereas in a different firm, you might have a similar project and say, well, we're going to charge a 75% margin on $9,000 worth of costs, because we know that we can't actually feasibly capture our account management time, because maybe in that organization, they're overseeing like a portfolio of 50 clients at a time, and they're constantly working across, and like it's basically impossible to capture their time directly on client projects. And therefore, we frame their cost as an indirect delivery cost, which would be similar to the creative director that doesn't really do much client work and is mostly managing the team of creatives and doing professional development and creative reviews and office hours and those kinds of things and one-on-one meetings with them. And in this case, you could argue that the account manager is acting more as a support cost for the broader delivery team and not as necessarily a direct cost on client projects. So those are the two levers that you have. You either figure out a way to estimate and lock that cost into your assessment of price and then log time against that. That will, to your point earlier, it'll affect your average billable rate. It will affect your utilization rates, or you don't attempt to do that because it's going to be a pain in the butt and it'll never be accurate. And you instead increase your margin target to account for that cost because you have an understanding of what percentage of your delivery cost that's going to represent on the P&L. And you price that into your work indirectly. Those are basically the options. And I think it comes down to what is the nature of this role? How feasible is it to capture their time? And oftentimes we're going to come into contact with this basically in the way that you described at the start of the show, which is like, for some clients who come in and you're like, hey, you have all this project management time that's being tracked. Tell me about how you price this into your work. And they're like, we don't. And it's like, well, in that case, you should probably just price it in directly, because we know that you can capture it and you're just not pricing it in directly. And then we can have a whole different conversation about, does that actually end up impacting the client at all? Because it doesn't have to. And then in other firms, you might go in and say, and see that there's no time tracking really for project managers at all, or it's all going towards internal buckets and their margins are bad. And in that case, you might say, hey, I think here it makes sense to adjust your margin target to account for this cost and probably a lot of the other costs that you're not factoring into your pricing today, so that when you sell projects, then you're actually accounting for all the things that it needs to cover. That's really the simple way to think about it. And I think a way that you can capture this and charge for it, regardless of whether or not it's actually feasible to track that time or to estimate how much of it's going to go into projects in the first place.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I like how simple it is. There are so many agencies, I think, that would just be vigorously nodding their head to go like, yes, I want to do that instead, because they've struggled with the other way for so long. And as I mentioned before, my only concern is we lose some of that visibility if we don't even try to track project management time. We just say like, it's too hard, we're not going to do it. We're just going to do it with a built-in margin. Then I lose that visibility into, well, which of our clients are eating up all of our PM time, and we lose some of that project level or client level visibility into profitability.
Well, and the reality is, like, I've described two extreme cases, but for the vast majority of our clients, they end up squarely in the middle, right? We end up with delivery targets, like direct client delivery targets for most PMs of anywhere from 15 to 30 hours a week. And the rest of them go into delivery overhead. So for most of our clients, if we think about how we design their model, right? Like, we are doing both. We are both including part of their cost in delivery overhead, and we're including part of their cost as a direct cost on projects. And so I think it's just, it's a spectrum. And I think it's just a question of saying, like, where do we land on that spectrum, and how much of this is actually feasible to capture as a direct versus how much of this is just sort of not going to be captured as direct. And to your point, still, I think reasonable to make efforts to track that stuff to the degree that it doesn't just kind of become like a waste of time.
Yeah. And even if you have I shouldn't say large, but even if, say, half of your time is in this sort of general bucket that doesn't get allocated to individual clients, and we're treating that as overhead, you're still going to be able to glean insights from the parts that you do track. And you're going to understand which of your clients are time sucks, and we need to adjust our pricing for that versus the ones that are, smooth sailing.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it. Yeah. Now, I do want to be very specific about language, right? Which is to say that the time that account and project managers spend working across a whole bunch of clients, in our framework, we do not consider that overhead. We consider it delivery overhead. There is a very important distinction between those two. So I just want to make sure we're very clear about that language. I do not recommend that ends up being like an administrative or sales and marketing cost. It's still a delivery cost, but it's not attributed directly to clients and projects. So you see it on the P&L, but you don't see it reflected in individual clients and projects, in the same way that like your Figma subscription is a delivery cost, but it doesn't show up on the cost for an individual client or project, for example. Yeah. Now, let's talk a little bit about the pricing side of this, because I think once we understand this concept, right, of like, at the end of the day, delivery margin is what is important, then I think it's important to also talk about how you can charge for account and project management time without making that explicit to the client. And I think that that's true across every single pricing model, right? So I've talked about this ad nauseum on other platforms, but it's worth talking about here as well, which is we might figure out based on our scope that like, okay, this project is going to cost us 10 grand. And then we decide, okay, we need to charge our 70% margin. So we need to charge $33,000 for this project. Well, that price can be articulated to the client in so many different ways. We could say it's 33 grand. We could say it's $3,000 of pass-through expenses or production expenses and $30,000 of agency fees. We could say it's, 3 sprints at $13,000 or $11,000 per sprint. We could say it's 330 hours at $100 per hour. We could say it's half that number of hours at double the hourly rate. We could say it's this many days at this day rate. We can break that down into distinct buckets by person, by role, or we could not. We can represent that price. That could be 33% management fee on, $100,000 worth of advertising spend. All of those are exactly the same to the client, and all of those are exactly the same to us in terms of our margin, as long as the scope doesn't change. And so also be aware that like you can charge for account and project management time without necessarily putting it in a proposal or on an invoice and presenting it to the client. And I think the argument that we're making here is like, you have to charge for it because you are incurring the cost regardless. And so the question is just like, how do you work it in so that the numbers make sense and that your margins are sustainable?
Yeah. In the situations where we find where this is not happening, where they're not building it into their pricing, that's, when I'm doing an assessment with the client, that's where the surprises arise. Like, oh, wait a minute, my margin's not what I thought it was. It's for this reason. And then they realize, okay, well, this is what we need to change. It's not always an easy change though, because now we're looking at the client saying, we're not going to do anything different. We're going to do the same things we've always done, but now we need to charge more because we realize we have these additional costs because we haven't built it into our margin or whatever. So that's where the tricky discussions around price increases come up. And it's just a visibility thing. Like you probably always needed to charge more. You just didn't know it until we started to do this kind of analysis.
Yeah. And of course, this gets into the whole, to your point, the pricing increase conversation. Of course, the first place to start doing this is on new clients and projects, which you should certainly do. And then with the existing clients, ideally, once your utilization starts to get high, you can start to renegotiate. You could try rescoping, repackaging. We did a really good episode with Casey Brown on pricing increases, which I encourage you to go listen to in the archives if you want to dig into that. But yeah, I mean, it is a difficult thing if you realize like, hey, we haven't really been pricing this in. And now all of a sudden, all these client engagements that we thought were good are probably set up for failure, actually, now that we consider it. And short of becoming far more efficient and finding a way to dramatically reduce the costs on those engagements, yeah, probably a pricing change is what's going to be required to make those things feasible. I'm curious, Carson, when it comes to these account and project management roles, you see a lot of different sort of structures inside of clients in terms of some are very, very highly billable and they're working on just a couple of really big projects. Other account and project managers are spread thin across a ton of different things. And I think we get asked about this a lot as well. Like, how should I be thinking about the structure of this sort of client service part of the business? What are your thoughts on that question generally? What's your framework for thinking through what makes sense for a given firm?
Are you talking about the division between account and project management, or are you talking about how we allocate those people across projects? All right. I mean, I've played both roles in the past, project management and account management. I've played that as a dual role in the past. And I think the problem I fundamentally have with it is you're serving almost like two different masters there. Like the project manager is really representing the agency, making sure things are on budget, making sure you're profitable, all that sort of thing. Whereas the account management role kind of is playing on the client side, making sure that they're happy, their needs are met, they're on the sales side of things. There's too much conflict between the roles that to really be effective with one person. So I do like to separate them out. It doesn't have to be like a person as a project manager and a person as an account manager. Your account manager role might be played by, the founder or something like but the roles do feel like they need to be segregated. So that's my big thought on that. And I think he has a whole website built out around this. Brett Harned, a good friend of mine, has some really good resources on that. So I'll dig that up and we can include that as well. Yeah. And then in terms of how many clients get assigned, I mean, it depends on so many factors. The question comes up all the time. And the answer is always the same, which is like, well, tell me more. How big are your clients? How much time do you need for them, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, the fewer clients that a project manager has to handle at any given time, the more focused they're going to be. And, that's just a function of, client size and costs and all that sort of thing. But I will say one thing within that context, which is, I remember, I wish I could remember where it came from, but someone was saying, hey, my project managers can't track time because they're jumping between, 8 different projects, every couple of hours. And the response was, well, that's your problem right there, is you shouldn't be structuring your day that you're jumping around that much. So it's more a personal productivity thing of saying, okay, I know I have 8 different clients to work on today, but can I split that into chunks so I can focus instead of jumping around all over the place, just finding those efficiencies.
Yeah. I'll echo, I think, some of the things that you said. It's interesting. I think it might have been on one of Brett's LinkedIn posts, actually, that I waxed philosophical about this. But I think at the end of the day, when you're thinking about how to structure that team, how to structure the responsibilities, and also when you're thinking about whether this person is going to index more towards being directly attributed to projects versus being indirectly seen as a cost in sort of the business model, as well as how many clients they're going to span and whether or not it makes sense for them to share this responsibility, I think the most important question underneath all of this will be, what is the nature of the work? And I think to the degree that projects are large in scale and very technical or very nuanced or very custom, you're going to lean towards more of a separation of those roles, account and project management being distinct, because you're leaning towards account management becoming an increasingly strategic role. And that being mostly the job of the account manager in that instance is like being a strategic partner to the client. And then you have this interesting tension and relationship between them and the project manager. That project manager tends to be less strategic and more technical in those kinds of instances, whether it's technical in the sense of like development or technical in the sense of like UX, whatever the subject matter is. And I think if you lean towards the other side of things where let's take an example of like the local marketing agency that is basically getting paid a retainer to run like local SEO for thousands of clients to the tune of a couple $100 a month. That is a very low strategy. Like it's probably okay for them to play the account management and the project management job because there's not a lot of depth to either. It's a volume play. They're going to be focused much more on sort of overseeing the system by which, accounts are renewed and canceled and, client service questions are answered. They're not going to play as much of a strategic role there. The project management function is also going to be far less critical thinking involved and far more like templatized and rolling of things out. So I think the nature of the work, the way that things are structured, how big, complex, and custom things are versus how templatized and repeatable and productized those things are, has significant implications into what makes sense for the design of that role, and therefore what makes sense for the treatment of that role and how feasible or unfeasible it is for them to track their time. And, there's long been this debate of like, should you separate account and project management? And I think like most nuanced things, the answer is, well, it depends. And the right answer for one firm probably isn't the right answer for another firm. At least that's been my observation. Like, I think that the dual role worked well for us because of how sort of streamlined and productized our services were. But certainly I've seen it not work well in other firms where the work is significantly more custom and the scopes of work are much bigger. So that's my take. So if you ever feel insecure about how you have things structured, go back to first principles and think about what really makes sense for us and what kind of business do we run here?
Mm-hmm. There's one other thing that I want to check in on with you, which is we talked earlier about, yes, these are delivery overhead expenses that we're talking about, but especially with account management, there's a bit of a blurred line there in that some of their role might be sales and marketing. Like clearly, this is not something related to delivery. This is, I'm trying to sell the client on the next level of product or whatever. In that case, are you good with treating those as pure overhead?
As long as it's explicit. I think it's rare that we see that be 100%, right? Like in our models, we'll see an account manager have a portion of their time allocated towards business development explicitly. So I think that makes sense. We see that for PMs too. We see that for lots of delivery roles, actually. There could be designers or strategists where it's like, we're going to deploy that skill set, that creative skill set towards our own sales and marketing. All of that is appropriate. You just have to make sure that you're accounting for that in your model. And that is something that we would, we're of course doing with clients as we go through everybody on the team. No one is sort of barred from being able to contribute to those parts of the business as long as it's explicit. I think what we need to watch out for, and what we're always watching out for, is how much of this is actually designed into their role versus how much of this is actually circumstantial. And we want to avoid that cost being reflected in overhead in a circumstantial way. To put that in plain English, it's like, we don't want to start pretending that this person is part of the sales and marketing team just because it's kind of slow. And so we were like, hey, go help the sales and marketing team, even though that's not actually designed into their job and not something that they're going to do no matter how busy the agency is. And that is the framing that I typically encourage people to apply when they're thinking about how to allocate people's costs to overhead, is like, it should only end up there if they have to do that, no matter how busy the firm is. It's like, that is a part of your job no matter what, as opposed to, we just pull them into these areas when it's slow and we're looking to give them busy work to do or something to, keep them occupied, because that just ends up inflating your overhead and often obfuscates the real problem, which is you have a utilization problem in your delivery part of your business.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been an interesting topic of conversation, one that might spark questions or comments. And so if you have those, do reach out to us. We love to hear from you. And with that, Carson, thank you for bringing this topic to the show. I think it was an important one for us to talk about.
Yeah, I can already think of a couple of our agency clients that will want to check this one out because I know they're struggling. All right.
Awesome.
Thanks, Marcel.
Thanks, Carson.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at Parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.